So as I got more and more interested in this whole question of the origin of life, I eventually went to England to do my graduate work, and I ended up doing my dissertation on the question of the origin of life. And as I began to, I started to investigate whether or not this mystery that I had encountered at an early scientific conference was as acute as I had thought. On the panel that I'd listened to at this conference in 1985, the scientists universally acknowledged that we didn't have an explanation for the origin of life, and they kept coming back to this problem of the origin of information. So as I began to investigate this is one of the first things I wanted to find out. Is this problem as difficult as I had been led to believe by my first exposure to discussions about the origin of life in the first place? And what I discovered was that it was indeed very difficult. There were a number of different approaches that scientists had devised to try to explain the origin of life. One of the first ones was to rely simply on chance. This isn't popular anymore with scientists, but in the 1950s, it was the first thing that occurred to many scientists. If you just have enough time, eventually you're going to stumble on to one of these sequences that will have the information that you need to build proteins. The problem with this is it became clear very quickly, however, and that is that there is so much information encoded in DNA and so little time, even assuming a 20 billion year universe all the way back to the Big Bang, that it becomes very, very difficult to imagine how you would ever stumble onto one of these very few functional sequences of characters in the DNA molecule or in proteins, either one. And the math is basically the same either way. I have a little illustration that I used in class a lot, where I would get my students who would usually, they'd often heard that, well, the way to explain life is by chance. If you give enough time, anything can happen. Well, first of all, you don't have an infinite amount of time. Even if you assume a 20 billion year universe, that's a finite amount of time. But secondly, I had them do a little thought experiment just to let's test how powerful is chance for producing information. And I'd walk around the class and have them pull letters out of a Scrabble bag at random. And the students would take the letters, and I got a blank here. That's not too helpful. And they get an N, and I had one rule: you had to write the letters on the board without thinking about the arrangement. You had to do them at random. So I get N, I, and Z, and L, and very quickly, picking letters at random, you get gibberish. Every once in a while, there'd be an exception to this. 2 or 3 letters in, you might have an important word like mug or ip or nid, or something that was at least word-like, and the students would go, we're going to prove the professor wrong. We're going to show that you can really you can generate information by chance. Well, you can get a little bit, but if you need a lot of information, the chance is not the way to go. And I would always illustrate this point, especially if the students were lucky enough to get a 2 or 3 letter word going, by just simply running the experiment longer and just keep walking around the room. By the time you get to the 6th, the 7th, the 8th letter, the gibberish was swamping the functional, the little elements of meaning that had maybe started to develop. And this is essentially what scientists working on the origin of life determined, which is that if you need a little bit of information, chance might get it for you. But if you need a lot of information, as you do in even a single gene is typically about 1,200 to 2,000 bases properly sequenced, genetic letters properly sequenced. That's a lot of information. And to build even a simple cell, estimates vary needing between 250 and 500 proteins and their corresponding genes. So one gene builds one protein, or roughly so. You've got a lot of information even to build a single cell. So the conclusion was chance can't get the job done. Now, here's a scientist who says as much, one of the leading origin of life researchers in Scotland. He says, blind chance is very limited. Low levels of organization, he can produce exceedingly easily the equivalent of a few small letters or words, but he becomes very quickly incompetent as the amount of organization increases. So I realized as I studied this more that attempts to explain the origin of information by reference to chance weren't going to get the job done. In fact, in my book, Signature in the Cell, I go through some very detailed calculations to show that even if you assume that every event from the beginning of the universe until now was devoted to attempting to find functional arrangements of amino acids or functional arrangements of bases out of all the possible arrangements, the odds are extremely small that you would ever stumble onto even a single protein. Odds on the order of 1 in a trillion trillion. And that's assuming all those trials, that every event, every interaction between molecules, all the way from the beginning till now, was devoted to looking for the informational sequences you need to build life. It's not enough time. It's not a plausible hypothesis. So, as a result of that, I began to investigate some other things, or rather, I began to study what other scientists had investigated, and I found that other attempts to explain the origin of information were also failing. And one of these was a kind of Darwinian attempt to combine the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection with chance. And because after all, the Darwinists never relied simply on chance alone. They always said you'd get a random mutation that would confer some small survival advantage on an organism, and then that advantage would be passed on because it would be preserved, because it allowed the organism to survive better. That's what was meant by natural selection. So that raised, some scientists said, well, maybe natural selection could be operating on a pre-biological level, before you had life, to explain the origin of information. Maybe it was operating on a kind of chemical level. But the problem with this is that it really stretched the concept of natural selection to a breaking point. When I just described how natural selection worked, what did I assume? I assumed that you had an organism that was capable of reproducing, and that you would get variations within the offspring, one of which would confer a survival or functional advantage, which would be preserved and passed on, and then you would gradually begin to alter the features of a population. That's the way Darwin's theory is supposed to work. But how can you make any sense of that if you're talking about a natural selection producing the information you need to build life in the first place? If you don't have life, you don't have reproduction. And if you don't have reproduction, you don't have natural selection. And so the problem with this proposal, sometimes called the idea of pre-biological natural selection, is that, as one evolutionary biologist said it, it's a contradiction in terms. It formally begs the question, to use the term that philosophers use. Here's a diagram that makes this clear. If you want to get natural selection going, you have to have living organisms that are capable of replicating themselves or reproducing themselves. And here's the rub. In all organisms, self-replication, whether it's by sexual or asexual means, occurs as the result of DNA being copied with the help of very specific proteins. So, wait a minute, what are we trying to explain the origin of? We're trying to explain the origin of the information in DNA and the critical sequence-specific proteins. So if you invoke natural selection to try to explain the origin of information, and yet you need information in order to make natural selection work, you've begged the question of where that information came from in the first place. It's like this. It's like the absent-minded philosopher who is walking home from class, and he gets halfway home and he falls in a pit because he's thinking deep philosophical thoughts. And he's at the bottom of the pit, and he suddenly realizes, wait a minute, there's no problem here. I can get out of this pit. All I have to do is get a ladder and climb out. So he says, no problem. He goes home and he gets a ladder, comes back, he jumps down in the pit and climbs out. What's wrong with the story? The story begs the question of how he got out of the pit in the first place. And this is the problem with invoking natural selection to explain the origin of information. You're invoking a mechanism that only works once you have information. And one leading scientist who works on the origin of life, the Nobel Prize-winning biochemist, Christian de Duve, has put it this way. He says, theories of pre-biological natural selection fail because they need information, which implies they have to presuppose what is being explained in the first place. So as I investigated this style of theory, this category of explanation, I realized that these were dead ends as well. Invariably, they beg the question of where do you get the information to even begin talking about natural selection. So that led me to a third category of proposed explanation for what I call the DNA enigma, for the origin of the information you need to produce the first life. And this is where more of the action has been recently among evolutionary scientists. They're trying to explain the origin of information by reference not to chance, but by reference to what is often called law or sometimes necessity. There's a famous book called Chance and Necessity by one of Francis Crick's colleagues. He was making the point that that's how scientists should go about their work. They should try to explain everything they see either by the result of chance or by the result of necessity. If I drop a ball and it falls to the earth, we say it falls as the result of the law of gravity, or that the law of gravity describes that motion, and then scientists will say because it's law-like, it happens by necessity. It must happen. Okay? So some scientists thought, well, if you can't explain life by chance, you can't explain life by chance and natural selection combined, maybe you can explain life as the result of pure natural law, natural necessity. And these guys had an idea which it was kind of sensible at the time. It was the late 60s when these ideas were first being formulated. And their idea was that just as crystals of salt form because of law-like forces of attraction between the different elements in the crystal. You got Na with a plus charge, and you got Cl with a minus charge. That describes a force of attraction. There's a bond that forms between the Na and the Cl, and as more and more of those elements come into contact with each other, they form a nice regular structure. NaCl, NaCl, NaCl. Highly ordered. And that ordering is the result of forces of chemical attraction that can be described by chemical formulas or laws of nature. Maybe, the suggestion was, maybe you could explain the ordering, the sequencing of the bases in the DNA molecule as a result of similar forces of chemical attraction. So it's not the result of chance, but it's the result of law. And certainly it's not the result of anything disreputable like intelligence or design. And so these ideas came to have a name. They were called self-organizational theories. The idea was that the ordering, the sequencing of the critical information-bearing parts of DNA and protein were the result of self-ordering tendencies that were chemical in nature. We see some self-ordering processes all the time. If you drain a bathtub, you get a nice vortex. The force of gravity acting on the water, being forced through that little hole creates an orderly structure. Could DNA, or more importantly, could the information in DNA be explained in a similar way? Well, it turns out it can't. And the diagram I have on the screen actually illustrates that, and I would ask you to give your attention to the chemicals on the interior of the DNA molecule. They're the bases. They're the information-carrying constituents of the DNA molecule. And also give your attention to the little sticks, the thin sticks in this. This is a representation of the chemical structure of DNA. The little sticks represent chemical bonds, forces of attraction. Do you see that there's a chemical bond between the circles and the pentagons, the sugars and the phosphates? Now, that sugar-phosphate backbone does not itself contain any information. That's the medium upon which the information is stuck. Do you see that there's a bond between the letters and that sugar-phosphate backbone? Okay? That there is a chemical force of attraction that causes the letters in the message to be stuck to the backbone. But do you see that there are no forces of attraction between the A's, C's, G's, and T's? No little sticks? Okay? Not like a crystal of salt where you would represent that with a bond. Here there's no force of chemical attraction responsible for the sequential arrangement of the A's, C's, G's, and T's. There is a bond that explains why the letters stick to the backbone, but that bond will allow any one of the four letters, the A, the C, the G, or the T, to stick. Any one of the four chemicals, the information-carrying chemicals, to stick at any site along the way. Now that's some pretty heavy chemistry, but let me make it real simple. Okay, I've got an illustration. Now, I'm pandering to the local audience here in eastern Washington and northern Idaho. I don't know if people from northern Idaho root for the Gonzaga Bulldogs basketball team, but everyone in Spokane that we've met this last week is mad about this basketball team, and they have a nickname called the Zags, okay? So if you're from Spokane, you might say, go Zags, all right? Now, this is a metallic chalkboard These are letters with little magnets in it, and I obviously have a small amount of information here on the board, right? A section of functional information. Now, here's a question. Can we explain the arrangement of these letters that constitute this message as a result of the magnetic forces of attraction that are in play here? Obviously, the answer is no, right? The magnets explain why the letters stick to the backboard, but they don't explain the arrangement of the letters. And I can demonstrate that simply by rearranging the letters to get this new non-message ogza-ag, okay? That is not a functional sequence of characters, all right? Same forces of physical attraction, but now there's no information, okay? What does explain, and now what I'm doing is I'm drawing a physical analogy to what's going on in DNA. In DNA, there is also not a backboard, but a backbone. There is a medium upon which the message is inscribed. There is also an informational sequence, a message, if you will. And there is a force of attraction that explains why the nucleotide bases stick to the backbone, but that force of attraction does not explain the sequential arrangement of the characters in the genetic message. A lot of scientists wanted to explain the origin of the information as a result of self-ordering, self-organizing properties of physics and chemistry. But you can see by looking carefully at the DNA molecule that you can no more explain the information in it as a result of those forces of chemical attraction that cause the bases to stick to the backbone than you can by invoking magnetic forces of attraction to explain the origin of our little message here. Okay? In both cases, in the words of the famous one famous chemist, he says the origin of the information is extraneous to the physics and chemistry. Where does the information come from in my illustration, by the way? It's obvious it's coming from, well, at least a quasi-intelligent designer. It came from me, right? Okay, from a mind, all right? So this is really, in a way, very suggestive. Now, as I began to look at, here's the famous chemist. His name is Michael Polanyi. He was a colleague of Einstein's and a brilliant man. In 1967-68, he wrote two articles, one called Life Transcending Physics and Chemistry, and another one in Science Magazine called Life's Irreducible Structure. And he made this point. He says, as the arrangement of the printed page is extraneous to the chemistry of the printed page, he's talking about like the ink in a headline. You've got chemistry that explains why the ink sticks to the paper, but that does not explain, he's going to say, how the ink gets arranged to convey information. As the arrangement of the printed page is extraneous to the chemistry of the printed page, so is the base sequence in a DNA molecule extraneous to the chemical forces at work in the molecule. You can't explain the information as a result of the physics and the chemistry. There's something beyond it that's responsible. Now, what could that be? Well, we've looked at chance, we've looked at chance, and we've looked at law, we've looked at chance and law combined. And as I began to investigate this question of the DNA enigma, I found that there were variations on these different models that I've been presenting today. So I haven't exhausted, done an exhaustive critique of all of them. But the same basic problems kept repeating over and over again. For example, scientists trying to explain the origin of information by reference to some sort of law-like properties of attraction or physical chemical laws ran into a kind of fundamental problem. Let's imagine, for example, that every time that there were some fundamental forces of attraction that were responsible for the arrangement of the bases in the DNA molecule. What would you get? What if every time you got an A, an adenine base, you got there was a sticky force that caused a guanine, a G, to attach. And that G then caused an A to attach. And that A then caused another G to attach. And on ad infinitum, what would you get? Would you have a molecule that was informational, that was capable of providing instructions for building an intricate protein structure? Imagine that someone were to stand up here and say, aga, 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 indefinitely. Would that be informational? Well, according to information scientists, the answer is no. What you have in that case is not, strictly speaking, information. It's what they call a redundant sequence. It's repeating over and over and over again. Now, you can explain order or describe order in a law-like way. Because it's repetitive, you can write a formula to describe it. For example, if you have a computer that's spitting out the sequence ABC over and over again, that's not communicating anything, but you could write a formula or an algorithm to ask the computer to do that. So sometimes you have scientists that have said, well, I know we don't have an explanation for the origin of the information you need to build the first life now, but we're going to discover a law of nature that's later going to help us explain the origin of information. Problem with that is that it's a contradiction in terms. What we call natural laws describe repetitive patterns. They describe things that happen the same way over and over again. If I drop a ball 10 times, I've witnessed the properties of gravitation the same way over and over again. Every time I drop the ball, it falls. Repeating patterns can be described by laws. But when we're talking about information, we're talking about something like the phrase, time and tide wait for no man. We're talking about something that isn't rigidly repeating, but rather something that is unpredictable, and yet where the characters involved are highly specified according to some convention, a grammar, a vocabulary, a code, in order to convey meaning or function. And so that's not something that can be explained by reference to a natural law. It's not repeating in the way that natural laws are. So as I looked at these different approaches, I found that they all kind of came up short, whether we're talking about chance, law-like properties, or law-like equations, or whether we were in some way combining the two, as the Darwinians had tried to do by combining natural selection, a law-like mechanism, with random mutational change. So I began to ask myself, well, is there anything else that we know of that's capable of producing information? And I one day came across a quotation from a scientist who was an early advocate or an early pioneer in applying information theory to molecular biology. And he said this, he said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. And this was kind of made a light go on for me, because at the same time, I was asking myself a question that had occurred to me as I first met some of the early advocates of the theory of intelligent design. One was a man named Charles Thaxton, who proposed that the information in DNA must have had some kind of intelligent source. He wrote a book in 1984 called The Mystery of Life's Origin, and I had occasion to meet him, and he had the idea, and it was somewhat intuitive at this point, that if you're talking about information, you're talking about something that is a mind product. And as I went off to grad school, knowing that it was such a problem to explain the origin of information, I began to wonder, could this intuition that information is pointing to mind or intelligence, could that be developed as a rigorous scientific argument? And naturally, as I began to investigate that question, I studied the works of Charles Darwin. Why? Because he had developed a scientific method for investigating events in the remote past. And he had a rule of reasoning that was very straightforward and commonsensical. And it was this. He said, if you're trying to explain an event in the remote past, like the origin of life or the origin of information, you should be looking for a cause that's known to produce the effect in question. Made perfect sense. If you're trying to explain the layer of ash across eastern Washington, we would opt for the earthquake not the earthquake hypothesis, or the flood hypothesis. We'd opt for the volcanic eruption hypothesis, right? Because we know that volcanoes have demonstrated the power to produce volcanic ash, whereas floods and earthquakes don't do that kind of thing. So when I saw this quotation, the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity, it made a light go on for me, because I remembered Darwin's rule of reasoning. If we're trying to explain an event in the remote past, we should be looking for a cause which is known to have the power to produce the effect in question, and known from our repeated experience. That was Darwin's key criterion. Well, this guy says, from our repeated experience, we habitually know that life is the product of conscious activity. And I asked myself a question, is that right? Is it true that information always comes from conscious activity? Is that what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, which, according to Darwin and his contemporaries and scientists today, is the basis of all scientific reasoning about the past? And I realized that it was. Not only had all these origin of life theories failed to come up with an alternative cause for the origin of information, we knew from ordinary experience that information always arises from an intelligent source. whether we're talking about a headline in a newspaper, a paragraph in a book, a hieroglyphic inscription, information embedded in a radio signal, information always comes from intelligence. So when we find information in the DNA molecule, I have argued in my book Signature in the Cell, we can infer with confidence that we are seeing evidence of a prior designing intelligence. Now, it turns out that we use this form of reasoning all the time. This is accepted not only in scientific circles, but in ordinary life. One day I was on the ferry, the Victoria Clipper, going up to Vancouver Island and Victoria Harbor in Canada. And as I entered the harbor, I looked out and I saw a pattern of red and yellow flowers on the hillside, and I have some astigmatism, and so I was attracted to this pattern, but I didn't know what it was, and so I put my glasses on, and I immediately drew what my colleague William Dembski calls a design inference. Why? Because the red and yellow pattern on the hillside was actually an arrangement of English characters that spelled the message, "Welcome to Victoria." And I made the brilliant deduction that gardeners had been at work, intelligent designers. Information is, in our experience, universally in our experience, an indicator of prior activity. Why? Because we know of no other cause other than intelligence that produces information in a digital form, especially when we're talking about functional information, information that does a job or communicates a message. Now, this principle is also conceded by people who have no vested interest in this debate and who are, in fact, metaphysically hostile to the idea that there might be an intelligent designer behind life. I refer to people who are investigating the possibility that there might be an intelligent designer or an intelligent being out in space, the project known as Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. This is a cartoon where you've got guys with the big radio telescopes looking for evidence of intelligent design embedded in a radio signal. What are they looking for? In the actual scientific world, not the cartoon, they're looking for information embedded in a radio signal in digital form. These guys in the cartoon say, as I read it, we're receiving a message from space telling us to stop bombarding them with unintelligent messages. One senator said of the Search for Extraterrestrial program, which has gotten quite a lot of federal money, he said, we'd do a lot better to use our money to look for intelligent life in Washington. In any case, what is my point? My point is that when we encounter information, we assume that it is the result of intelligence. And that even scientists who are hostile to the intelligent design hypothesis in biology assume that if they were to find information embedded in a radio signal coming from space, that they were encountering ET. They were encountering an extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, thankfully, or not thankfully, depending on your point of view, we have not encountered such an intelligence in outer space, and no evidence of same. But in the inner workings of the cell, in the DNA molecule, we have a compelling indicator of intelligent activity, and that is the information in the DNA molecule. And what I've done in the book Signature in the Cell is actually develop this case as a rigorous scientific argument using the method that Charles Darwin himself used in The Origin of Species. And I come to the ironic conclusion that Darwin was wrong about that there was no evidence of actual design. Darwin used a method that's sometimes called the method of multiple competing hypotheses. And that's what I've done in this lecture. You compare different possible explanations or causes to try to explain a key effect or event in the remote past. You evaluate them to see which cause best explains the evidence, and then you infer that cause which provides the best explanation. Now, the key question, the obvious question is, what constitutes the best explanation? Well, Darwin and other scientists have had that worked out. They said that the explanation that was best was the one that referred to a cause which is known from our uniform and repeated experience to produce the effect in question. Darwin's scientific mentor, Charles Lyell, the famous geologist, put it this way. He says that we should be looking for causes that are now in operation. And when I saw that phrase, another light bulb went on for me, because I asked the question, what is the cause now operating that is known to have the power to produce information? And again, there's only one. It's intelligence. And so I concluded in the case I make in the book, using Darwin's method, that if you look at all the competing classes of causal explanation that have been provided or proposed to explain the origin of information, that intelligence or intelligent design is the best explanation. Neither chance nor necessity, law-like necessity, nor the combination of chance and necessity have demonstrated the power to produce information, but intelligent agents have repeatedly done so, and therefore intelligent design stands as the best explanation for the DNA enigma, this critical mystery of the origin of the information you need to build the first life.